Hi there, it's Gority Golden here and welcome to my brand new series on web hosting, Made Simple. These series are designed for beginners who want to understand how websites actually live on the internet without getting lost into too much technical jargon. So in this series, I'm going to walk you step by step through everything you need to know about hosting your website. So we shall start from the very basics, like what hosting really means, what is a domain, and how the DNS connects everything, and we shall later on move into the hands-on on things like the cPanel, how do we upload files to the cPanel, how do we manage emails, and even connecting your website to the database, and of course having your site or your websites fully hosted or deployed on the server. So by the end of this series, you will be confident enough to host your own website or even help someone else set up theirs. So let's get started with the very first video in this series, where we are going to focus on what hosting is, the different types of hosting, what domains are, what subdomains are, and you're also going to get insights on what a DNS is and what IP addresses are on the other hand, and we shall also get more insights on what environments are. So thank you, and I hope you stick around. So in the context of websites and applications, hosting refers to the service that makes your website accessible on the internet. So it's more like the space on a server where your website's files are stored, allowing users to view your content when they type in your domain name. So with hosting, we always work with a server, and a server is a computer, but it can also be a system. But the server mainly provides resources or data or even other services to computers, and these computers are always known as clients. And this is always done over the internet or over the network. So a server can always be a hardware or a software, but its main role is to handle the requests that clients do make. And the server will always have to provide what we call as a response, all the necessary information according to the request that the client computer has sent. So the server runs all the time, and anyone around the world can visit your site at any time. So you can think of hosting like renting a house, in that your website files are always going to act as, for example, the furniture inside the house. So anyone who has your house address can always come and visit. So hosting ensures that all our project files, for example, if you're trying to build a website, by the time you host, we ensure that all the website files are going to be stored on a particular server. So that brings us to the different types of hosting, and I'm going to focus on the common ones. So the first type is the shared hosting. So with shared hosting, many websites always live on the same server. So this is one of the commonest type of hosting, and it's actually the cheapest, though at some point it is a little bit slower since a number of users are already sharing the same server, but it is very good for beginners. Then on the other hand, we also have a VPS hosting. So the VPS is always like a virtual private server, in that it is always one physical server that can be divided into some other virtual servers. So you always have more control, and this kind of hosting provides better performance on the other hand. Then in addition, we also have a dedicated hosting type, and with the dedicated hosting type, you always have one whole server and it is always dedicated just for you. However much it is dedicated, you always come to understand that these kind of servers are always expensive, and most of the times we use them for big websites. Then in addition to the types of hosting, we also have a managed hosting type. This one works more like for content management systems like WordPress. So with this type of hosting, the hosting provider always manages the updates or maybe sometimes backups and security services for you. So whenever people say that they buy hosting, they usually mean that they purchased some space on a server. So the most common options for beginners is always the shared hosting, because most of the times, it's not even most of the times, but it's really affordable and easy to set up. And moving forward, we are going to be mainly working with the shared hosting type for the practical series. So now that brings us to domains. Now, whenever we are going to work with hosting, it is very key that you also understand what domains are. And a domain is always your website's name. For example, if we do have something like google.com, or of course, if you're going to build your own website, we believe that that site could have a particular brand. So the brand name that you assign to your project, for example, if I'm building one of maybe my own portfolio, I could first of all ensure that I'm choosing a domain name that is unique. So most of the times domain names are unique, just like we have seen that emails are always unique and you're not going to find any other person with your own email. And just like we have also seen that the contacts or our phone numbers are always unique. So the domain name is always unique and a user-friendly one. For example, if it's going to be a portfolio site, I could have something like goretigolden.com. So the .com is always the top level domain, and I'll share insights on that later. But domain names are always user-friendly, and without a domain name, people would need to type a long string of what we call as numbers that are called IP addresses. So domains make the internet human-friendly in that you do not always have to cram the IP addresses for you to access our website. So you can think of a domain like your contact name in a phone, in that instead of remembering someone's number, you just search their name, and the same way, instead of again remembering an IP address that we are going to understand later, we just use the domain, like for example, google.com, then you go ahead and access the server. So when it comes to IP addresses, every computer or server always has an IP address, like for example, a phone number. I'm just giving an example. But in terms of network communication or communication over the internet, every computer is always assigned a unique IP address to ensure that it's identified over the internet. So IP addresses vary depending on the version. We always have a number of them. For example, the IP version 4, which is always an IP address with 4 octets. And also we also have the IP version 6, which is always a combination of different hexadecimal characters. So the domains are always linked to the IP addresses, and when you type a domain, the internet secretly converts the domain name into an IP address, which is the real location of the server. So that brings us to the domain name system, also known as the DNS. So the DNS is more like the phone book of the internet, and it always translates domains into the IP addresses. So when you type, for example, youtube.com, the domain name system finds the server's IP address, and then it connects you to the server, in that you're able to receive maybe a response from the other server that you requested for via youtube.com. So the analogy here is that the domain name system is like your phone's contact list. When you click on someone's name, and your phone automatically calls their number, the domain name system does the same for websites. So you do not always have to memorize or know the exact number of that person, for example, to whom you're trying to call. So as long as you know the name or the domain name, the request will always be, the domain name server will always translate or handle for you the process behind the scenes. So with domains, we always have subdomains, and a subdomain is like a section under your main domain or the primary domain. So for example, if we do have a primary domain called, for example, golden.com, And on the other hand, if I really had a blog where I do post my other content, I could come up with a subdomain, which is, for example, blog.golden.com. So with subdomains, the first name is always user defined, meaning that you can work with anything, but the syntax is always the name of this other subdomain, but also ensuring that it's concatenated with the primary domain. So domains always help us to organize our big websites. And so you can think of a domain as an apartment inside a building. So the main domain is the building, for example, and the subdomains are now the separate rooms or the units inside the building. So now that brings us to environments. So with environments, we always have two of them, and that is the development environment and the production environment. So the development environment is where you test and build your website or API or mobile application. It's always where you do the implementation and go ahead and test everything with the development server. And on the other hand, with the production environment, this is where the live version of your product comes in and the world gets to see the real product. Then also sometimes, or anyway, it depends, but there are also cases whereby we also have the staging environment, which is also known as the pre-production environment, and this one is always like a mirror of your production for final testing. So most of the times it is always accessible via a restricted subdomain and realistic configurations. And most of the times whenever we are working with, for example, pre-production and the production environment, we ensure that we do not turn on the debug modes, because while in development the debug mode is always on, and you always have the ability of maybe handling the errors, or sometimes even throwing the errors that have been thrown as exceptions. You always have the ability of looking at all that. But when we are switching to production or pre-production, most of the time we turn off the debug mode, and most of the times the way we handle, for example, the exceptions, we work with logging or logs. And with production and maybe pre-production, we tend to work with backup modes to ensure that in case of anything that occurs, we still have a backup of our product that is live. And also, in addition, most of the times we also work with SSL in terms of security. So most of the live products or sites or APIs and etc., you always note that apparently we have the HTTPS protocol to ensure that the data is always encrypted and to ensure that the products are always secure. So in addition to the environments, most of the times there are cases whereby we also work with the environment variables, where you're going to store all that in your .env. And in this kind of approach, we tend to store secrets, like maybe the database passwords, the API keys, and we also ensure that we do not commit secrets to GitHub for those that are working with the version control systems. And in terms of the environment variables, each environment always has its own .env. So meaning that you could have a different environment for development and also another for production. Because most of the times, for example, if it is a development API, you could be hosting the application on the local server. But when we switch to production, the production API is always going to point on maybe a subdomain or your primary domain. So maybe to summarize this one, we also ensure that most of the times if we are going to host, there is also what we call the cross-origin resource sharing, and this is always an HTTP header mechanism that allows a server to indicate any origins, like for example the domain or a port or a scheme, other than its own, from which a browser should permit loading. For example, if the front end and the back end projects are on different hosts, for example, if the back end is on maybe api.golden.com and then the front end is on the primary domain like golden.com, so that we could always configure cause on the back end to allow the front end origin. So we shall see how to implement all these in the practical sessions, but I believe that these insights would really make more sense as we move forward. So that is it for this series. In the next video, we will start exploring the cPanel. But now that you already have the mental picture of what domain names are, what IP addresses are, how the DNS connects both of them, domain, and insights on what subdomains are. So we shall be building on those concepts for the next video. See you again in the next video, and thanks for watching.